All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I see more people entering the room. Fantastic, fantastic. Really appreciate everybody being timely. We got a great class today. Some Q&A questions that people have in their mind. I'm just going to give it a few more moments, for more people to enter, and then we will kick it off. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining me on this great opportunity for us to share what's on our mind, questions about things that you may be thinking about this year, whether because of the new administration, whether because you have retirement on your mind, whether something else is on your mind. So some good opportunity to ask the questions and address those questions as well. Before I dive into the material, I first want to remind everybody that these classes do not happen in a vacuum. They happen because I have people supporting me. I have my clients, I have my members. If you know somebody who's a client or a member, can you please give them a hug and say thank you, because they're the ones that keep me going? And if you want to become a client or a member, I will tell you about how to do so towards the end of today's class. Fantastic. So let us get involved in the Q&A, the questions and answers. I got dozens of questions. Let's see how many of these questions we could get through. Hopefully I'll be able to get through. And by the way, if you guys like this Q&A format, if you feel that this is just a great way to share your thoughts with me and me getting back to you, if you guys like this format, please do me a favor, send me an email. I'd love to hear if this type of Q&A format is something that resonates with the audience. Okay, fantastic. Now, before I dive into the answers to the questions, I would not be surprised if most of you know my answers already, because I address these questions in my trainings. So if you've been to one of my trainings, there's a very good chance that you've already heard my presentation on all, or if not all, then most of these topics, okay? With that being said, I actually want to mention something about training. Just recently, I was giving a training to a group of federal employees. And this training came about because there was somebody who had taken my training in the past, and they said they want to bring this type of training to their group, to their federal employees. So there's one person who said, you know what, let's bring Stefan in and let's make a training happen. So I was able to deliver a class for her audience, okay? You could do the same thing. If anybody here feels that they want a training in their agency, you could do the same thing. And let me just remind you that your agencies are scheduling their 2026 training right now. Right now, it's already on their mind. Okay, I've already spoken to one agency. We already have some classes on the schedule for 2026. So if anybody here wants to get a class in for 2026, I know that the training budgets have been adjusted, but let me just remind you, OPM still has their financial literacy mandate. And federal benefits are certainly related to your job. They're related to your employment. So if anybody's interested in pulling a class like this at their agency, whether it's a virtual class, whether it's an in-person training, send me an email. You can make the introduction, and I could take it from there. Okay, fantastic. Let's get into the questions. There were a lot of questions. Some of them had common themes, so I try to lump the questions or the questions with common themes together. So let us try to tackle some of those themes. Some of the themes have to do with threats to federal benefits, RIFs, reduction in force, insurance questions, health insurance, life insurance, TSP questions, and then there's some miscellaneous questions as well. So let us dive in. The first series of questions, there were a number of questions as far as threats to benefits. Okay, people are very concerned. This is, obviously a concern that's on people's minds, threats to benefits. So I have over here just a few questions that have to do with the threats of benefits. John, Katie, and another question from John. So the first question is, are the federal employees' pensions safe? Kathy's question is, do you think the Trump administration will get rid of the retirees' FEHB? John's question is that will new federal employees have to pay more into their retirement system? Fine, fantastic. So let's start with the first John's questions. Are federal employees' pensions safe? And the answer to that question is Yes and no. So just so you know, I have heard this concern for at least a dozen years. This has nothing to do with the new administration. Of course, the new administration is making people very, very nervous. But just so you know, all the threats that you've heard about federal benefits being changed, for example, changing your high 3 to a high 5, removing the fake Social Security, the first supplement, or removing the FEHB for retirees. This is not the first time these proposals have been made. And I would almost assure you this is not going to be the last time these proposals are made. It comes up almost every time there's a change in administration. And I'm not concerned. I'm not concerned for a few reasons. Number one, they've been talking about this all the time and they never seem to implement it. That's number one. Number two, even if they do implement it, it's usually for the new employees going forward. And the ones that are already in, they just get grandfathered in, which we'll talk about that in just a second. And then number three, even if there is a change, it doesn't go into effect instantaneously. There's usually a runway, a lead up time. So at least you have the ability to then reevaluate your course of action. So are federal employee pensions safe? My general sentiment is yes, they're fine. And by the way, when I say my general sentiment, let me remind everybody, for those who don't know, my wife is a federal employee. In my financial plans, I include her pension, the regular pension. Okay? So I include her pension. Now, I realize that that's an assumption. And whenever you make an assumption in your financial plan, who has to live with those assumptions? You do. So obviously, if you feel that one of your assumptions is not to your liking, if you feel that, Stefan, maybe we should not assume the full pension, maybe we should assume a reduced pension, maybe we should assume that FEHB is not going to be entirely subsidized by the government. It's going to be whatever the government subsidy is going to be, is going to go away in retirement. If you want to change those assumptions, I'm happy to make changes in your projections. But just going forward, for my wife, I assume the pension is going to be there. For the health insurance, I assume that the health insurance is going to be there as well. So these are assumptions that I assume. So that's why when you ask me, are federal pensions safe? My answer is yes and no. The reason why I say no is because it could be that the pension was misstructured, just like Social Security was misstructured. As we all know, Social Security is running out of money. And if they don't change the Social Security system in some way, they may have to start scaling back benefits in less than 10 years from now. That's not because they need to, there's new rules and the new administration changed the Social Security system. That has nothing to do with that. That has to do with the misstructuring of the benefits to begin with. I'm sure you guys heard about this. I'm sure you heard that in 2013, new hires in the first retirement system, they have to pay more into the first retirement system. Let me say it again. In 2013, OPM rolled out a new version of the first retirement system where the new employees have to pay more into the system. So, for example, if you were hired before 2013, you're paying 0.8% into your first retirement system. If you're hired after 2013, depending upon when you were hired, some of you are paying 4.4% for the same exact benefits. Same exact benefits. You're just paying more. Now, why are you paying more for the same benefits? Well, one of the reasons is because in order to keep the system afloat, we need more money. So, are your pensions safe? The answer is yes and no. And ultimately, if you want to use it as an assumption or if you don't want to include it as an assumption, that's going to be up to you whether you include it or not in your financial plans. Just so you guys know, from my clients, I'm sure you've heard this from me before. When I project my clients' pensions, I assume zero COLAs. Zero COLAs. That's one of my conservative assumptions that I bake into my financial plans. Fantastic. So Kathy's question has to do with, will the Trump administration get rid of retirees' FEHB or make them pay for the entire cost of the insurance? So Kathy, it's a great question. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that question, but here's what I will tell you. We do have a precedent of a previous president removing or changing the rules for FEHB for retirees. For example, President Biden. I don't know, does anybody here remember what President Biden did in 2022? So President Biden had his, I forget what it's called, the Postal Service Reform Act, PSRA, the Postal Service. You guys can look it up. You can Google it. Okay. So Postal Service Reform Act 2022, President Biden required that postal employees get Medicare with their FEHB. Okay. So it could very well be that the same way President Biden made postal employees get Medicare with the FEHB. That wasn't originally the plan. There are many federal employees, they retired just relying on their FEHB. They were not planning on getting Medicare. But then came President Biden and he forced them to get Medicare. So is that a possibility in the future? It is a possibility in the future. Will it happen? I don't know. My assumption is that it's probably not going to happen. But I do have good news for you, that if it does happen, the Postal Employee Reform Act may be a precedent, because what happened with the Postal Employee Reform Act is that the postal employees were forced to have Medicare, but they were not penalized for picking it up late. That's a big deal. So it could be that you guys could just choose your FEHB without the Medicare. And in the future, if they force you to have Medicare, so then you could get it without penalty. That could very well be the case. Now, coming back to Kathy's question, she's not necessarily asking about Medicare. She's asking about, will the government portion be removed and now you have to pay the full portion? And the answer may be, it could be. And at that point, you may have to take Medicare. And the question is, meaning not have to, but meaning you may want to take Medicare, because at that point, Medicare may be less expensive. And the question is, in that situation, will there be a penalty for picking up Medicare late, or will it be like we saw with the postal employees, that they were able to pick up Medicare late and they were not penalized for it? So I don't know the definitive. I don't have a crystal ball. Obviously, it's possible for them to change the rules. My assumption is that they're not going to change the rules, but even if they do change the rules, hopefully the precedent is that you could get Medicare at that time without penalties, and Medicare without penalties should be cheaper than having to pay the full FEHB premium. Okay. John's question. My understanding is that there will be an increase in retirement contributions for new hires. Would this apply to employees who leave and come back to federal service? Are there any changes that could be enforced to existing federal employees? So that's a great question, John. So the answer is that so long as you have 5 years in your current employment with the federal government, so if you have 5 years of service and you leave service and then come back later, you usually get put back into the system that you're in right now. Okay, so long as you have the 5 years, that's generally the way it works. So to answer your question, if you leave and come back to service, you'll probably come back to where you are, and you'll have to pay the 0.8% as opposed to the 4.4%. Okay. Now, with this being said, I'm going to give you guys general guidance. When someone leaves federal service, they have the choice to either keep their FERS contributions in the system or withdraw their FERS contributions out of the system. My general recommendation: keep your FERS contributions in the system. You're going to get a pension in the future based upon those years of service that you've done. Okay. So if you have, let's say, 5 years of service, you can get a pension based on those 5 years of service. And that pension is very valuable. It's usually much more valuable than the money that you're pulling out and some of the interest that you get on that money that you pull out. So again, my general recommendation would be that if you leave federal service, keep your FERS contributions in the system. Okay. Let's move on to the second grouping of questions, which have to do with RIFs, the reduction in force. So let's start with Stefan's question. First question over here. I'm probably being removed from federal service this month for declining to relocate. I'm also eligible for retirement. So I have to admit, when I looked at this question, I wasn't clear on the question, and I'm still not clear on the question. Okay, I'll tell you why. Because if you decline to relocate, that sounds like there was a reduction in force, and they came to you with what's called a reasonable offer, and you declined the reasonable offer. If I understand you correctly, I don't know all the details here, but if you declined the reasonable offer, well, that means you're not eligible for the RIF, for the DSR. That means you're not eligible for the discontinued service retirement, because they didn't discontinue your service. They gave you the option of relocating, right? And you declined that option. So you may have declined what's called a reasonable offer. Declining your reasonable offer is tantamount to quitting. You basically quit. So when you say that you are eligible for retirement, my question is, what retirement? Are you talking about the DSR, the discontinued service retirement, or are you talking about regular retirement? And the answer to your question depends on which type of retirement you're referring to. If you were talking about that you were eligible for regular retirement, you will be able to keep your federal federal health insurance benefits as long as you satisfy the 5-year rule, which I assume that you did. Okay, so meaning as follows: if you had FEHB for the last 5 years, and now there's this reduction in force, they came to you with a reasonable offer, and you said, nah, I'm not interested, I'm going to choose to retire. If you were eligible for a regular retirement or MRA plus 10 retirement, as we'll see in the next question, If you are eligible for regular retirement or MRA plus 10 retirement, you are able to keep your FEHB in retirement as long as you satisfy the 5-year rule. However, Stefan, if you were not eligible for a regular retirement, if you're not eligible for a retirement, if you're not eligible for the DSR because you declined a reasonable offer, I have news for you. That means you're basically separating without being eligible for an immediate retirement. And if you separate without being eligible for an immediate retirement, you are not able to keep those benefits. Okay? Fine. Let's move on to Jonathan's questions. When RIFT, what are healthcare options and how can I keep my federal health insurance if I take the MRA plus 10 at 57? And how do I minimize financial penalties from taking MRA plus 10 at 57? So, John, your question suggests that you know a lot about this thing called MRA plus 10. Okay, so some of the people in the audience may know, may not know. If you get RIFT, okay, and by the way, just so you guys know, all the questions that I've answered thus far, not only do I address these in my classes, but I have the answers to them written out in articles on my website. Okay, so for example, should you be worried about the new proposed legislation? I have an article about that. And what happens if you get RIFT? I have an article about that as well. Okay, so let's talk about this. If you get RIFT, so my question for you, John, is are you eligible for the DSR? In order to be eligible for DSR, that means you have to not quit, not decline a reasonable offer, and you have to have either a 50 with 20 years of service or any age with 25 years of service. So, John, if you met those criteria and you get RIFT, you could continue the health insurance into retirement, no problem. Okay. However, John, from your question, it sounds like you're thinking that you're not going to be eligible for the DSR, but you may be eligible for the MRA plus 10 retirement. If you choose MRA plus 10 retirement, you have two choices. You could retire and collect your pension immediately with a reduced benefit, or you could retire and postpone your pension until a regular retirement qualification. Okay? There's a big difference between those two. Aside from the penalty, meaning if you retire and you take your pension immediately, aside from the fact that there's a penalty, you are able to continue your FEHB right away. However, if you choose to postpone, if you postpone until a regular retirement qualification, it's true, you avoided the penalty, but you are not going to have FEHB during those years that you postpone. So, for example, if you postpone from 57 to 62, you do not have FEHB from the age of 57 to 62. That means you're going to have to buy your own health insurance. And you're not going to have a government subsidy to pay for your own health insurance. You're going to have to get your own health insurance on your own. And that's going to cost you a lot of money. I don't know if you guys realize that the cost of health insurance, if you did not have the government paying their 70% or whatever the percentage is, the cost of health insurance would be thousands and thousands of dollars more. I'll just give you an example. If you have a family plan, it's just a regular family plan with FEHB, the government portion alone is about $15,000. $15,000. So that means if you do not have FEHB from 57 to 62, that means you're going to have to get your own health insurance plan. That means you're going to have to pay not just your portion, but also the government $15,000. If you think about it, 15,000 times 5 years, that's going to cost you $75,000. So, if you're concerned about financial penalties, my question for you is, which penalty are you more concerned about? Are you concerned about the reduced pension, or are you concerned about the $75,000 cost of health insurance that you just imposed upon yourself? Just so you know, Jonathan, my general recommendation is to, if you're in that situation where you're going to be delaying for 5 years without health insurance, if you're in that situation, I would actually tell you to take the pension right away, with the reduced pension right away. Your rate is reduced. However, the reduction you'll make if you delayed, the amount of time it takes you to make back what you delayed is about 15 years. And then when you add on top of that the $15,000 of FEHB premiums that you cost yourself for 5 years in a row, it's going to take you like 32 years to break even. So I would just say take it early. There are situations where I tell people to postpone. That's, for example, I'll give you a great example. Let's say you retired MRA plus 10, but you have health insurance through some other means, whether you have a spouse that has health insurance or you have TRICARE. So by you postponing, you don't incur an additional health insurance cost. And there's one more detail. if you postpone, you're not postponing for 5 years, you postpone for less than 5 years. That's like 3 years or 2 years. In the situation like that, where you have the health insurance and you're only postponing for a couple of years, I might just tell you to delay to avoid the penalty. But if you're postponing for 5 years, I would tell you not to delay. And if you're postponing for 5 years and it's going to incur the additional health insurance cost, I'm definitely not going to tell you to postpone. Okay, Kara, I have been RIFed and I'm not eligible to retire. Are there any options for me to access my TSP funds if I need to without being penalized? And Lilica has a similar question. My agency is facing massive RIF if pushed into retirement, which I am eligible for. What is your advice regarding the TSP in that case? So Kara and Lilica, I have news for you. If you guys get RIFed, can you access your TSP? The answer is yes. And I have 2 strategies, or let's say 3 strategies for accessing your TSP. The first strategy for accessing your TSP is the very simple one. If you are age 59 and a half when you separate from federal service, you're fine. 59 and a half is what's known as the age-based withdrawal. You are able to access your TSP without penalty if you're 59 and a half. Okay, so that's number one. That's easy. That's for everybody. Okay. However, if you're not age 59 and a half, then the question is, if you separate from federal service due to RIF, what age are you? What age are you? Because that's going to be critical. So, for example, if you are RIFed in the year that you turn age 55, there's something known as the age 55 rule. And the age 55 rule, believe it or not, will give you access to your TSP without penalty. So let me say it again, Kara and Lilica, if you are RIFed and you're RIFed in the year that you are turning age 55, you can access your TSP without penalty. Okay. However, if you are below the age of 55, then the only other option for you that I have to access your TSP without penalty is if you use something called 72T. Okay, 72T. The IRS allows you to structure substantially equal payments from your retirement accounts, whether it's a TSP or an IRA or 401k. So long as you structure payments that are designed to last your life expectancy. It doesn't literally have to last your life expectancy. It just has to be designed to last your life expectancy. And by the way, as I mentioned, I have an article that explains this as well. So I would encourage you guys, if anybody here has not yet navigated my website, I have an article that explains what happens if you get separate before the age of 59 and a half and how to access your TSP before the age of 59 and a half. Okay. Fantastic. Amazing. Let us go to the next series of questions. The next series of questions are the insurances. So let's go one at a time. Jill's question is, my husband and I are both feds. Ooh, 2 federal employees, what I call the untouchables. We are both over 50 with at least 20 years of service. My husband carries and always has the FHB plan for our family. If I take the VERA and retire, and then later my husband gets converted to Schedule F and fired, can I take over FEHB? So to answer your question, Jill, yes, you can. That is, if your husband gets fired and he loses his FEHB coverage, that is considered a qualifying event where you could adjust your health insurance plan. Just so you know, qualifying events, one of the qualifying events is if you have a dependent and loses coverage. So then you could adjust, or if you yourself lose FEHB coverage because your spouse was the plan and they lost their FEHB coverage, that is a qualifying event for you to pick up FEHB on your own. Now you may say, Jill, that I already retired. Can I pick up FEHB in retirement if my husband loses his FEHB due to a Schedule F firing? And the answer is yes. Even in retirement, that is considered a qualifying event for you to pick up. And so long as you had FEHB for the 5 years before you separated, which, Jill, it sounds like from your question, you're going to have FEHB. It's not going to be your own FEHB. You're going to be under your husband's FEHB. But believe it or not, being under your husband's FEHB counts towards your 5-year requirement. Okay, so Jill, you've satisfied the 5-year requirement by being under your husband's plan. If your husband gets fired, then that is a qualifying event for you to pick up your own FEHB. Next, Dan and Greg have similar questions. Dan's question is, how much life insurance should a retiree carry into retirement, and how should you pay for it, whether it's FEGLI or private? Greg's question is, can you talk about first annuities, specifically considerations for no survivor benefit versus the 50% or the 25% survivor benefit? I will be retiring under Vero no later than December 31st, and I need to figure out what is the best for my spouse. Okay, so Dan and Greg, okay, let me tell you what most of my clients do. Most of my clients, they choose the 25% survivor option. However, with that being said, I got that out of the way. Now that I said most of my clients choose the 25% survivor option, let me just be very clear about something. When they choose whatever they choose, it's not because they guessed. You don't guess on these things. You don't guess on early death scenarios. You don't guess on whether your spouse could survive when you pass away financially. You test and you measure your ability to do so. This is exactly what the financial planning process does. This is definitely what I do for my clients. Okay, so this is like ABCs of financial planning. Okay, so with that being said, you got to test. And when I test, I find most of my clients end up choosing the 25% survivor option. However, let me be very, very clear about something. There are many clients that I tell to leave zero, nothing, no survivor benefit, no FEGLI, okay, nothing. But then I also have some clients where I tell them to leave the maximum. Okay, so really, let me flip the question on you guys. Do you even need life insurance? That's really the question. Do you even need life insurance? And the answer is, for most people, yes, they could benefit from the 25% survivor option. However, there are a chunk of people that don't need any life insurance, and there's some people who need the maximum life insurance. Let me give you an example of somebody who I said should leave the maximum survivor benefit, and also the maximum FEGLI. Okay, I'll give you a great example. So one of my clients this year, unfortunately, was diagnosed with a terminal illness. So they don't really have much of a life expectancy. Now, it happens to be this client and their spouse, they have plenty of money. They have plenty of assets. Like, money's not an issue for them. But even with that being said, even with money not being an issue, I'm telling this client to leave the maximum survivor benefit, the maximum FEGLI. Why would I do that? The reason is obvious. This person only has a few more years left to live. That means they're only going to be paying a little bit towards their survivor benefits and a little bit towards their FEGLI life insurance. And then they pass away and they leave their survivors a huge benefit. So the benefit that their survivors get relative to what they have to pay, that is a fantastic rate of return. By the way, if you understand what I just did, I basically just converted this life insurance conversation into a rate of return conversation. Only a sick, twisted financial advisor could do such a thing. But that's what I do. I'm basically looking at your premiums as an investment and what is going to be the return on that investment. So if somebody has a very short life expectancy, I'm going to tell them to max out on their survivor benefits. And I'm also going to tell them to max out on their FEGLI in that situation. Okay, let me give you a situation where I actually tell my clients to max their survivor, but don't do the FEGLI. Isn't that interesting? There's a situation where I tell them to do the max survivor, but not the FEGLI. It's very, very simple, actually. So I have a number of clients in this. Let's say you have a husband and a wife. The husband's a federal employee. The wife is not a federal employee. And the husband is many, many years older than his wife. Now, statistically speaking, I'm sure you guys know this. Guys don't live as well, don't live as long as the girls. Okay, guys die first. Okay, guys, I'm just letting you guys know. Okay, guys, they have the privilege of dying first. So if I'm dealing with a guy who is significantly older than his spouse, that means that his spouse, who's a girl, is very likely to outlive him. By the way, if they were the same age, the female would likely outlive her male husband. So that's if they're the same age. If the guy is much older and she's much younger, so then she is certainly going to outlive her husband. And not only will she outlive him, but she will probably get back not just all the money he paid into that survivor benefit, but even a nice rate of return on top of that money. Once again, the rate of return conversation. So that's a situation where I'm not going to tell them to do the FEGLI, but I am going to tell them to do the maximum survivor benefit. So if there's anybody in this room that is, let's say, a male federal employee, and he has a wife, and the wife is significantly younger. When I say significantly, it's usually 6+ years younger. So the husband's 6+ years older than the wife. In that case, I tell them to choose the maximum survivor. However, on the flip side, there are situations where I tell them to do zero survivor. I'll give you an obvious example. Let's say you have a federal employee and the federal employee's spouse is the one with the terminal illness. So that means that spouse is very likely going to pass away in the near future. Why should the federal employee pay for life insurance and survivor benefits to leave something for their spouse, who the spouse anyhow has a very, very short life expectancy? Very, very likely the spouse is going to pass away before them. In that situation, I actually say you don't need any life insurance. Okay? So I hope I'm making sense on you. But Dan and Greg, with any of the scenarios, you don't guess on these things, you measure. Sean is asking a question on the bottom of the slide. How does portability work with our government life insurance? And if you quit and you want to take it with you, I understand I have to pay the premiums, but do you know how inexpensive to truly do that? Okay, so Sean, just so you know, if you quit federal service, you are able to have a temporary continuation of your life insurance for, I want to say, 31 days. 31 days. And during that period of time, if you want to continue, you actually have to apply for a continuation of your federally life insurance coverage. You're basically going to apply to have your federally coverage converted from a group term policy to a personal whole life policy. And I don't know if you guys know, whole life policies are relatively expensive. They're going to be more expensive than a term policy. What's nice is that there's no underwriting. If you do that, there's no underwriting on that conversion. Okay, so that's very nice. But for those who have been to my class, you may know my attitude when it comes to whole life insurance. Whole life insurance is basically an instrument where you put money into the instrument. Over time, it grows, and in the future, it's worth more money. And when you pass away, they give that money to your survivors. Now, is anybody detecting what I'm trying to describe? What I'm trying to describe is that you're putting your money into instrument, and over time it grows, and in the future it's worth more money. Doesn't that remind you of anything? It reminds me of your TSB. You know, you put money into it, over time it grows, and in the future it's worth more. So basically, a whole life policy is a form of investment instrument. Once it's a form of investment instrument, I try to look at the rate of return. And if you look at the rate of return on a whole life policy, usually it's a very modest rate of return. The guarantees are usually about 4% growth rate, but even the 4% growth rate, the internal rate of return is usually less than 4%. Okay, again, I'm not going to get into those details, but you could look into it on your own. The internal rate of return on a whole life policy is usually under 4%. As opposed to your TSB, which, you know, it depends on what you're investing in, but had you invested in the C fund, I'm just pointing out the C fund for the past half a century has yielded over 10%, which is obviously better than the 4%. And at the end of the day, they're just going to cut a check to your survivors using your money, which basically means you are the insurance company that is backing your policy. That is self-insurance. So when it comes to whole life policies, I'm not a big fan. All right. There's always exceptions. There's always places for these types of things. But for the vast, vast, vast majority of federal employees, the whole life is not really the strategy that's not the strategy of choice. Okay. Let's move on to some TSB questions. TSB, we have a number of TSB questions. And in addition to questions about the TSB, there's also just questions about investment strategies. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So let's start with Lynn's question. Lynn's question is, any new strategies for TSB investing in retirement? Lynn, I have great news for you. I have no new strategies. I'm just using the same strategy again and again and again. It's tested and true. In that sense, you'd almost call it timeless, okay? However, the strategy that I implement, which if you've been to any of my trainings, you probably know the answer to this question. The strategy I implement for the retirees is I have two buckets. It's what's known as a bucket strategy. The two buckets consist of an aggressive bucket, which is designed to be the growth engine of your portfolio, and a conservative bucket. The conservative bucket consists of conservative instruments, okay? Like in the TSB, you have conservative funds. Fantastic. Now, the job of the aggressive bucket is to be the growth engine of your portfolio. What's the job of the conservative bucket? So the way I structure it, the job of the conservative bucket is to buy time for the aggressive bucket. Buy time. Let me explain what I mean. We're not naive. We know that the stock market does not always go up. It sometimes goes down. But please tell me, is the stock market going down intrinsically bad? I'm sure you guys have lived through enough downturns to realize that even when it comes down, eventually it does come back up. So the stock market going down is not intrinsically bad. It's only bad if you needed that money right then when it was down. But let's say you didn't need the money right then. Let's say you were able to give it time. Then that money, even though it was down, okay, it was down now, but eventually it'll come back. So what we need to do in your portfolio is we need your money exposed to growth because you want your money performing. You want your money growing. However, we can't be naive. We realize that there's going to be times when it goes down, but we just also have to realize that when it's down, that's not a problem if you're able to give it time. And the way I buy time for my client's portfolio is I carve out another bucket, a conservative bucket, and that conservative bucket buys them time. The way I measure time is I basically see how much money they need from their investments, and whatever money they need from their investments, that money I secure in their conservative bucket. And by the way, when I measure how much money they need, so this is the approach that I take. I set aside 10 years of investment income, which, by the way, I have clients that say that's way too conservative. Okay, fine. If they want to take more risk, that's for them to acknowledge that they're taking more risk. My default is I'm setting aside 10 years of investment income. So basically what that means is I forecast into the future how much money they will need for the first 10 years of retirement. Whatever money they need, the investment income, I set that aside in a very conservative instrument. And I have conservative instruments within the TSB, and I have conservative instruments outside the TSB. Okay? But by setting aside those 10 years, what that means is even if the stock portion of their portfolio goes down, it's irrelevant for at least 10 years because I set aside a 10-year bucket. And the stock market usually recovers and then some in the 10-year period. Is it guaranteed? There's no guarantees, right? But it just happens to be historically what has happened 97.5% of the time. so it's a pretty strong statistic. Okay, Denise's question, a very similar question. If our retirement income is covering basic monthly expenses, how many years of cash or bonds, meaning how many years of conservative money, do you recommend to fund wants and wishes? So Denise, I think your question acknowledges my strategy, my 10-year strategy. Your question is just a little bit of a nuance, which is, do I calculate wants and wishes differently than your basic expenses? And the answer is no. To me, a successful financial plan is when my clients are able to achieve what they want successfully over the course of their lifetime. When I say what they want, not just what they barely could afford, I'm talking about what they want. That to me is the success of the plan, okay? And sometimes the answer is that they can't do everything they want. Sometimes we have to scale back. But when I'm projecting into the future, so for example, if they want to take a vacation, I'm already budgeting for that vacation. If they want to do a home improvement, I'm already budgeting for that home improvement. If they want to buy a new car, I'm already budgeting for that new car. This is all in my 10-year projection. So when I'm setting aside 10 years of income, 10 years of investment income, that 10 years was calculated with not just their basic needs, but also their wishes and wants include. That makes it a successful plan. Okay? Donna, my spouse and I are federal employees. He's retired 1 month and I plan to retire in 2 years. Do you have any advice on possible adjustments needed to our retirement and regular investment portfolios during this transition period? Okay, fantastic. So Donna, I hear your question. So here's the couple of approaches we have to take. The first approach is, as I just mentioned, that when you retire, I want to make sure you have secured 10 years of investment income. Okay, but here's the thing. When do you start setting aside the 10-year conservative bucket? Do you set it aside the day before you retire, or the week before you retire, or the month or the year before you retire? So the way I do it is I start setting aside a gradual transition that starts the 5 years prior to you needing your investment income. Now, notice the way I answered that question. I didn't say 5 years before retirement. I said 5 years prior to needing investment income. Those are not the same thing. It could be that you're going to be retired, but your spouse is still working. And while they're working, you may not need investment income. Okay? Or vice versa, Donna, in your case, he's retiring and you're going to continue working. So while you're working, you don't need investment income. But here's the thing, Donna, it sounds like you're retiring in 2 years. So Donna, you are already within my 5-year gradual transition period. So basically what I do is the 5 years before you need investment income, I take the 10-year conservative amount of money, whatever that money is, and I divide it into 5 pieces. And 1/5 gets set aside in a conservative bucket 5 years before you need the money. The next 5th gets set aside 4 years. The next 5th, the 3 years. The next 5th, 2 years, and the last 5th is 1 year before retirement. This way, I'm not doing it all at once. I'm just doing a 5th gradually over the 5 years prior to you needing your investment income. This way, by the end of 5 years, your 10 years are set safely and securely in that 10-year bucket. Okay, fantastic. Pete, upon my retirement in 2026, what are some considerations as far as keeping my funds in the TSB versus moving down to a traditional IRA, which I have previous private sector employer rollover? Fantastic. Anne has a very similar question. Should I roll my money out of the TSB and into the private sector like Fidelity or Schwab? So my answer to Pete and to Anne is as follows. Did you know everything you could do in the TSB, you could do outside the TSB for cheaper and with greater flexibility? Okay. By the way, this is also an article of mine. I have an article that actually lists off 14 differences between TSB and IRA. So Pete and Ann, I'm actually not going to go through all the 14 differences in this presentation. You should definitely look up my article, The 14 Differences Between TSB and IRA, and you'll be able to see, which one of the differences gives the TSB the advantage, which one of the differences gives the IRA the advantages. Okay. I will tell you that once you've separated from service, the IRA has the majority of the advantages. And I'll just give you 2 of the obvious benefits that the IRA has over the TSB. Number 1, if you remember a few moments ago, I mentioned I have a bucket strategy. Okay, I have my aggressive bucket, I have my conservative bucket. Which bucket do I draw from in retirement? Well, it actually depends. It depends on whether the market is up or the market is down. If the market is up, you draw the income from the growth of the portfolio. However, if the market is down, don't touch it while it's down, please. It just needs time. And the way you give it time is by not touching it in down years, but instead, during the down years, you draw from your conservative bucket. So basically, if you want to follow my bucket strategy, and it's not my bucket strategy, it's a well-known strategy. If you want to use a bucket strategy, you're going to have to be able to say, I'm choosing from this bucket at certain times, and I am not choosing from that bucket at certain times. I'm choosing from another bucket at certain times. I have news for you. The TSB will not let you choose which fund you access. Meaning, when you request money from the TSB, can you specify that you only want G fund money and not C fund money? No, you cannot. When you request a withdrawal, it's going to be sent to you pro rata from all your funds proportionally. Okay? So the TSB does not give you the ability to be strategic with your withdrawals. They're going to send you money pro rata. The IRA will give you much more flexibility. You could be much more specific and selective where you take the money from. Another difference between TSB and IRA, and again, there's 14 differences, so I'm not going to go through all the list, but another difference. If you have any Roth money, which some of you do, some of you don't, but if you have Roth money, just be aware that the Roth money in your TSB is going to be allocated the same way you allocate your traditional money. So for example, let's say you have, I'm just giving you as an example, half your money in the C fund and half your money in the G fund. Let's just say that was the case. Well, guess what? Your Roth is also going to have half in the G fund and half in the C fund. And that's not ideal because the benefit of the Roth is that all the growth that takes place in the Roth is tax-free. All the growth. So if you have tax-free growth in your Roth, what type of growth would you like? Would you like to have itty-bitty G fund growth? Or would you like to have the robust C fund growth? Now, I realize you want to have robust growth everywhere, but if you are setting up a bucket strategy, that means some of your money is going to be growth-oriented and some of your money is not. I want the growth-oriented money for sure inside the Roth, okay? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have growth in the traditional, but for sure in the Roth, not G fund in the Roth. Fantastic. Heidi has a question. Regarding TSB distributions, how does that process work? How often can you change the amounts? If you have a monthly distribution but then need additional funds for a certain event, can you do that? So Heidi, yes, you could actually take out partial withdrawals in retirement from your TSB. They allow you to take a monthly installment payment. That is what you're describing, a monthly installment payments. And you could also take a partial withdrawal, and you could do partial withdrawals once a month or once every 30 days. So basically, you could take theoretically 12 partial withdrawals a year. Or as you're describing, Heidi, you could set up a monthly installment option. You could change your monthly option as often. But let's say you just want to keep your monthly installment option and choose one partial withdrawal of $10,000 to go on vacation. Or let's say one $10,000 withdrawal to go on vacation at the beginning of the year, and then maybe another $30,000 withdrawal to buy yourself a new car during the summer. Yes, you could do that. You have that additional flexibility now. That is something that the TSP has expanded. It's very, very nice to see. Okay, investment options. Okay, and by the way, I do see that we're getting a little bit late over here. I'll try to address as many of the questions as I can. And if I don't address your questions, then what I would like to hear from the audience is if you do like this Q&A format and you want to do more of these types of Q&As, just send me an email and let me know, and we could arrange for another type of Q&A, whether it's before the end of this year or whether it's at the beginning of next year. That would be a very nice thing. Okay, fine. So let's make progress over here. So Kara, what are the safest options to grow a lump sum of money safely? Is it a high yield savings account or CD? So Kara, I'm assuming you're talking about outside the TSP. Inside the TSP, there's really one fund that is the safest of the fund. That is the G fund. You cannot lose principal in the G fund. Okay, fine. So that is the safe fund in the G fund. The F fund, which is a bond fund, is relatively conservative. But let's be honest, you could lose money in the F fund. Yes, you can. However, if you're talking about the safest option to grow money safely, is it a high yield savings account or a CD? So, Kara, I'm going to challenge your question. How do you define safe? The reason why I say that is because there's an argument to say that the stock market is safe. That's blasphemous. How can you say such a thing? Well, I'm being very, very serious. Have you ever seen how when you introduce time into your portfolio, it actually reduces the risk of your portfolio? So, for example, there have been studies done on the S&P 500 over different denominations of time. And if you look at the S&P 500's performance over a 1 year period, you're right. There are a lot of chances of losing money over a 1 year period. However, if you look at it over a 10-year period or a 20-year period, your chances of losing money decrease significantly. And I'm quite sure over a 20-year period with the S&P 500, there has never been a 20-year period of time that would have ended with a loss. Right? Just let me say it again. There's never been a 20-year period of time in the S&P 500 which would have ended you with less money than you started. Okay, so basically what that means is that on a 1 year basis, your chance of losing money is relatively high. I think the percentages they say is like 27% chance of losing money on a 1 year basis. But on a 20-year basis, your chance of losing money drops to pretty much zero. That sounds pretty safe. But Kara, I think I understand what your question is. Your question is, no. I want something that doesn't even have the chance of losing money. Something that's like super, super conservative that even on a 1 year basis doesn't have a chance of losing money. So Kara, outside the TSP, there are a few instruments that you could use. There are a few instruments that I encourage people to use, which is, so first of all, yes, you have the high yield savings accounts. Okay, so high yield savings accounts, I mean, these days there are high yield savings accounts that are earning 3.5%. That's pretty good. There's also high yield money market accounts, which are yielding these days around 4.25%, which is pretty good, right? So those are instruments that are available. Also, there are indexed annuities. Those are insurance contracts that give you guaranteed growth in your money, and some of them are about 5% growth guaranteed. Now, the insurance contracts, you just have to be careful with them because some of them have a surrender period. What that means, a surrender period, is that you have to leave it there for a certain amount of years, and if you cancel the contract early, there's a penalty for canceling the contract early. So just be careful of that. But even so, I mean, if they're giving you a 5% yield, with guarantees attached to it, that's pretty good. So if you have to keep your money there for a 3 year or 5 years, sometime it still might be worth considering. Although, again, when it comes to annuities, that's something which that's like my last resort. Fine. Carol has a question. Are you rethinking the iFund? Ooh, Carol is challenging me. Carol is basically saying, Stefan, I've been to your class before, and I know your attitude about the iFund. So for those who don't know my attitude on the iFund is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment to stock investing. And it hasn't just been an embarrassment to stock investment for 1 year or 2 year or 5 year, 10 years. We're talking about since inception. We're talking about over the past 30 plus years. Let me put in perspective. You guys can look at the TSP fund performance. If you go to the TSP website, you'll actually see it, okay? The iFund performance since inception, that means not just for 5 years, 10 years, I'm talking about that since for the past 30 years, about the iPhone performance is half of the American stock funds, half the C fund, half the S fund. Now, what Carol's question is Stefan, look at which of the stock funds is performing the best this year. So far this year, 2026, the iFund is the one that is doing the best this year. And you know what I have to say about that, Carol? Good for the iFund. I'm very, very happy for the iFund. I'll tell you why I'm not impressed. Because if you look at the iFund's history, you'll notice that you're right. Once a decade, it has a good year. Wow. Once a decade. Very, very good. However, the other 9 years of the decade, it has an abysmal performance. So let's compare the American stock funds, the C fund, for example, to the I fund. And you look at, its 10-year performances. You may find that the I fund in a 10-year period, it has 9 bad years and 1 good year. And the C fund is almost the opposite. Good years and 1 bad year. Okay. So that's what you're comparing. So if you were to hire one of those two for your portfolio, which one would you hire? Would you hire the one that 9 out of 10 times does a good job, but one time it does a lousy job? Or would you do the one that does 9 out of 10 times does a lousy job, and every now and then it surprises us with a good performance? So the fact that the I fund is having a good year, and understandable because of the tariffs, so there's been a shift of investing outside the United States, fantastic, okay? But still, the American companies that are represented by the C fund and the S fund, those companies are not just doing business inside America, they're doing business outside America too. Global presence. And their innovation, the innovation in the American economy is phenomenal. There's a reason why we're the number one economy in the world, for the innovation, for the governance. So these things keep America as the strongest economy in the world. And therefore, I am still very, very bullish, I guess, on the C and S funds. And the I fund, I'm just not impressed. Now, I'm always rethinking my positions. I'm always looking for challenges. I'm always looking to see if my strategies stand up to the test of time. And thankfully, as I mentioned before, my strategies have been quite timeless. They have not changed. Fantastic. Deborah's question is, my mortgage interest is 3.75%. Deborah, do not accelerate payments on that. I'm not sure how to say better than that. All right. Don't you dare. Okay. This is the cheapest money ever. I know some people who have even lower interest rates. Don't you dare. Now, let me see Deborah's question. I'm trying to determine what investment would exceed the return. So, Deborah, I just mentioned to you the high yield money market funds are yielding 4.25. Okay. And some of these fixed instruments are yielding higher than that. And again, historically speaking, the stocks have done higher than that. So you think about paying off your mortgage in 7 years. Now, Deborah, why would you want to pay off in 7 years? Right? Why? What's the rush? What's the rush? There's really the 3.75. All I look at, the mortgage in my eyes is just another expense. The same way you have property taxes and you have homeowners insurance, you also have a mortgage to pay. I know you could reduce things, but the money that you use to reduce your debt, that's money that is not performing elsewhere. And you have to ask yourself, can I do better than the 3.75 elsewhere? And the answer is, it depends on what you invest in. But as I just gave you a few examples that are outpacing a 3.75, namely the high yield money markets, the indexed annuities, and if you're willing to take more risk, historically speaking, the stocks have done better than that. But obviously, on a 1 year versus a 10 year, it's a difference in how much time you give it. Kimberly, I started saving for retirement pretty late and I feel like I'm behind, but I'm freaking out about the student loan repayment and how expensive that will be. Oh, I understand what you're saying. Some people are going to have their cash flows reduced pretty significantly soon because of those student loans that are coming due. I reduced my 401k contributions. That makes sense. You got to get the government match. That's good. So I can add more money to my savings, pay down debt. Is there an alternative for this? So Kimberly, you're not alone. There's a lot of people in your boat. Okay. The answer to the question as to whether or not you should be accelerating payments on your student loans, it really boils down to what is the interest rate on those student loans, and usually the interest rates are high. Okay, the way I call high is I have something called the 7% line. It's a line that I draw in the sand. So if you have a debt that's charging you an interest rate of 7% or higher, I usually prioritize the debt over the market. However, if you have an interest rate that is below 7%, like 6% or below, so then I would tell you to prioritize the market over the student loans. Okay. But I understand you're going to need money in your cash flow to pay those student loans. So is there an alternative to this plan? I think it really depends on how high the interest rates are. If the interest rates are 7% or above, I'm going to agree with you. You probably should prioritize those, getting rid of those loans. Another way, Kimberly, you could do that is by refinancing your house. You can obviously consolidate loans, but I'm sure you know that mortgage interest rates are super high these days. So you're really just jumping from one high interest rate environment to another. So if interest rates ever come down on your on real estate, you might be able to do a consolidation with a second mortgage or a home equity line of credit. That is another option. But right now, interest rates are just so high, it's not even worth it. Adrian, okay, so we're going to stop. Adrian's question is the last question. I actually have more questions beyond this. So I have like a whole bunch more. And I also saw I got about a dozen more questions just today. So it looks like people are interested in having the questions answered. And I'd love to answer those questions in a future class. Just give me feedback. Let me know if this is something you want to have more often. So let's end with Adrian's question. Adrian, which of the following two scenarios is better over a short, medium, or long term? Either number one, moving money from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA, or number two, moving money from a traditional IRA to a brokerage account. Okay, so let's talk about on the short term. When I say short term, I mean within 5 years. Within 5 years, there's no question moving it from the traditional into a brokerage account is better than a Roth. And the reason is very simple, because the Roth has a 5-year rule. So, for example, if you do not have an existing Roth account and you just start taking money out of your traditional and start creating your Roth account now, you would have a 5-year clock that you need to wait for. So if you're talking about with accessing this money within 5 years, I'm going to tell you that the traditional to the brokerage is preferable over the traditional to the Roth. Okay, so that's number one. However, if you go to the medium term, the Roth, moving the traditional to the Roth is going to be better than moving it to the brokerage account. The reason is as follows. Whenever you take money out of the traditional and you move it to a Roth or a brokerage account, you're going to owe taxes on that. And the question is, that tax liability, how long will it take for the growth of your investments to make up that tax liability? So I have news for you. The growth of your Roth and the growth of your brokerage account, you may have the same growth. You may have S&P 500 growth in both of those. But here's the thing. The growth of the Roth, once you get past 5 years, is zero taxation on the growth. As opposed to the growth of the brokerage account, you're going to have to pay capital gains taxes, long-term capital gains, which obviously zero tax is better than long-term gains tax. So once you get beyond that 5-year period, usually the Roth is going to be the way to go. There's a little bit of math that needs to be calculated over there, but usually the Roth is the way to go. And then for the long term, I may have a very surprising answer for you, Adrian, which is as follows. When you say the long term, I could actually give you a situation where there's no difference between moving it to a Roth versus moving it to a brokerage account. For example, do you know what happens to a brokerage account upon death? The money gets left over to the heirs, and the heirs enjoy a stepped-up basis, in which case there is zero tax on the gains in that brokerage account that you leave to your heirs. So if there's zero tax on the gains, that's the same thing as a Roth. There's zero tax on the gains in your Roth. So when you say long-term, Adrian, what are you referring to as long-term? You're talking about long-term like leaving over to your heirs, or are you talking about long-term like later in life? So if it's later in life, the Roth is going to be the solution. But if it's talking about like long-term, I'm leaving this money over to my heirs, then at that point, there's really not much of a difference between Roth and the brokerage account, because both of them are going to be passing with zero taxes on the gains to your heirs. Okay, fantastic. Let us end the conversation there. I do have more questions. However, it's going to take me a much longer to get into those questions. And I would encourage you guys to stay connect with me. If you have any more questions, you could definitely come to future classes where we'll do more questions. I also want to mention, if anybody's interested in meeting with me, okay, so you could request a meeting with me by clicking on the link that I pushed into the sidebar. So if you guys see in the sidebar, request a meeting with my team. So if you click that green button, it'll take you to a web form, and the web form will, if you fill out that web form, so then I can have someone from my team reach out to you and schedule time to get together. I really appreciate you guys spending time with me today. I know I'm going hyper fast, and I hope I covered, much of the stuff that you guys were hoping for, even though I realized I didn't cover all the stuff, but I hope to do so in a future class. So thank you so much for attending today's class, and please keep in touch. Don't be strangers. I look forward to seeing you on a future webinar, or as I mentioned, if you guys want this type of action-packed class brought into your agency, whether it's a virtual class or an in-person class, you should make an email introduction. Introduce me to your training officer, introduce me to your team, and I will see you at an office near you. All the best, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.